So welcome everyone to today's presentation, Conversations on Inclusivity series, Critical Computation, Inclusive's Future, lectures, part of the Festival for Digital Futures. And I'm going to start with brief introductions. One moment, let me share my screen. Does everyone see my screen real quick?
Yes.
Okay. So today we have, I am so honored to be with the panelists today, Professor Joanne Couture-Marin, Professor Daniel Cardoso-Locke, Professor Anu Vikram, and Professor Andrew Culp. I'm so happy to be here today because they've inspired me in different times and at different places, and I feel very interdisciplinary. So let's get to it. This is Dr. Couture-Marin, UCSB, Professor Daniel Cardoso-Locke, CMU, Professor Anu Vikram, UCLA, USC, Professor Andrew Culp from CalArts. I just put on this slide briefly just to kind of note what the Conversations of Inclusivity series is about. I won't go through it in detail, but we're going to address some of these topics. I'm just going to read this one little part for today. For critical computation, this panel addresses the role of critical computation and relationship to information. How has innovation changed our relationship to institutional power and our global economies? What new societal potentials does AI, a digital metaverse, and quantum computing bring both near and distant futures? Computation deals with a lot of issues of bias. What are the ways that we need to change to make computation more inclusive and ethical? Let's begin. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I invite, the order today is as follows. Joanne Couture-Marin, Daniel, Anu, and then Andrew. So let's begin with Dr. Couture-Marin.
Okay, let me share my screen. Make sure my sound is on for the brief sounds that I have, and let me put up my slideshow presentation. I've got to do all of the technical stuff here. Okay, it seems to be loading, and I will put it on slideshow. All right, I think I'm good to go. Okay, I'm pleased to be here in order to discuss my research and creative practice and how to make complex information tangible and reachable to all. I'm a composer and a researcher in multimodal media systems, content, and facilities design. I built a large immersive instrument. You see it in the upper of this one slide. It's the Allosphere, and the software to run this instrument based on music, composition, and performance. This will facilitate communication of information using our senses, visual, sonic, and tactile information. The Allosphere research mission is to lead the way in information technology systems designed through interactive virtual experimentation of complex data across fields such as nano, biotech, quantum computing, using arts as the driver for this communication. The instrument, software, and content is scalable, and in this way, we can bring this out to the general public. The photo below shows a design of a 1,000-square-foot museum installation with a slice of the Allosphere screen, a 100-degree curved projection screen. In this installation, we were able to bring quantum mechanics right out to the general public by making a visual sonic instrument out of the data and allowing people to experience this information through their senses. We are a digital media center within the California Nanosystems Institute, and we are designed for new materials and information technology systems. We focus on high-performance computing, quantum computing, biogenerative research, and the arts through emergent media, interactive visualization, representation of complex data, for scientific discovery, and for unique forms of art. This slide, which is pretty wordy, describes our two branches of research: multimedia systems, display, and interface technologies, content areas within the California Nanosystems Institute driving multimedia systems, hardware, software design. This slide actually shows how big the Allosphere is. It is a large computational display that's hooked to a high-performance computing system and a number of different instruments. You see in the upper right-hand corner, tri-beams, atom probes, and also all of our virtual instruments that we control the Allosphere with. So now I'm going to play a short video, and we're going to do a fly-through into the Allosphere. Here we are, we're flying into the Allosphere. We're going to be on the bridge of the Allosphere, and we're going to be flying out so that you can actually see. And right now, this is a piece of metal as thin as a hair that we're data mining at the atomic level. And from this, you can see that we can interactively control any data, multi-user interactive control. This is myself playing my quantum mechanics synthesizer that we had in the museum. This is how we bring things out to the general public. As this plays, I would like to be discussing how composing and performing complex systems like quantum mechanics by using this model of music and composition and performance, and how I built the Allosphere instrument and the ELOlib software based on this process, making this complex information available to everyone. First, let's define complex systems. A complex system is an arrangement of a great number of related but various elements with intricate relationships and interconnections. They are difficult to model and predict. Components of a complex system may appear to act spontaneously, such that predicting the outcome of the complete system at any given point of time may be difficult, if not impossible. In this respect, composing music is analogous to building a complex system. The system changes and unfolds over time at many different levels of temporal and spatial dimensions, and the outcome of the total system may not be predictable at various stages of composing the work. Music consists of various mathematical languages that build complex systems, such as physics and other disciplines as well. So let us discuss how I moved from building complex systems through music composition and performance by using the orchestra and performers as the platform, and the musical score built from various mathematical languages as the program, to using a distributed computational instrument as the platform, with human-computer interaction devices used by the performers' researchers, and the score built from a software computational language, allowing any researcher to use the mathematics of their field to map complex data through visual, sonic, interactive representation. This was my first instrument, the orchestra, which is analogous to a server-clients model, a large distributed mechanical engineering instrument. The conductors, the server, the instruments are the clients, performed by the performers, which serve as the interactive interface. Using these concepts over the years of my building distributed computational systems on this model, the distributed computational platform becomes the instrument, and the code becomes the program or the score to be performed by the computational platform. With the computer as the compositional tool, one can now begin to build the score as a set of visual, sonic, mathematical algorithms designed to exist at various levels of time and scale. We have designed and developed this language as a set of mathematical libraries. It's on GitHub for everybody to take, open source, in C++ code with Python scripting languages running front end for real-time interaction, processing, and control. This now becomes the tool for our compositional score. The orchestra is a distributed computational platform that can perform the score. In the next two slides, you see the instrument I've designed, the Allosphere, a 3-story metal cylinder in an echo-free chamber. 20 researchers stand on a bridge suspended in the middle of the cylinder and perform their data with wireless devices. A 14-computer rendering cluster drives 26 immersive projectors and 54.1 channels of sound. The next slide shows the performance of my quantum composition on a large tablet interface. a virtual synthesizer, which I can control the quantum numbers. Here is the interface. To make my quantum composition, I began my studies in 2008 with physicist Professor Luca Politi and media arts researcher Lance Putnam from my Ionosphere research group. We presented our studies in composing elementary wave functions of a hydrogen-like atom and identify several relationships between physical phenomena and musical composition that helped guide the process. The hydrogen-like atom describes some of the fundamental quantum mechanical phenomena of nature and supplies the composer with a set of well-defined mathematical constraints that can create a wide variety of spatio-temporal patterns. We explore the visual sonic appearance of time-dependent combinations of 2 and 3 eigenfunctions of an electron with spin in a hydrogen-like atom, highlighting the resulting symmetries and symmetry changes. This complex information is now tangible to all. And I'll play just 2 minutes of my newest composition, which is called Mirioi, again, for everybody to experience in museums, installations, and actually play with the quantum information. These are 3 probability wave functions of the hydrogen-like atom. These wave functions are combining, and we have a string of agents that are solving for the probability currents and the gradients. You're actually seeing these wave function combinations with these bands of agents that are coming together and showing the possibility of where the electron is in any given point of time in a hydrogen-like atom as it's split into superposition. The sonification is actually the agents, which are sonifying the waveform structure. The timbres are the probability wave function, standing waves. The notes are mine. That is my part of the artistic contribution to this scientific experiment. So here's the team. I couldn't do it without any of them. I'm just the conductor. They do all the work. They're brilliant, absolutely incredible. I thank Dr. Rincon, who was a PhD in my Ionosphere research group and did all of the architectural CAD drawings that helped me to be able to see what I had actually built and to find ways to make very small instruments like the curved screen design that you've seen. Anyway, thank you so much for listening to me, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. Thank you so much. Let me get rid of all of my information that's on here. Oops, excuse me, I'm back again. Here.
Well, thank you so much, Professor. Anyway, Dr. Kuchamaran,
just call me Joanne.
I can honestly say I wouldn't have gotten or survived my PhD without her. I think she dragged me through whatever you need to do to make a student succeed. So I honor her for being, I think, one of the most amazing educators I've been around. So thank you very much. And our next speaker is Professor Locke. So please share your screen.
Yes, just 1 second. Let's make sure that everything is in place. So thank you, Gustavo, and thank you to John, for that great presentation. I'm really happy to see that more spaces are opening for computation to be approached critically in the context of computing and design and the arts. That's very exciting, because an important element in my research and scholarship is to try to cultivate spaces for that kind of conversation as well, and how to think about technologies, digital technologies, not just in terms of their functionality, but also as artifacts worthy of critical inquiry and creative intervention. And I think that's really important today, because crucial, I would say, because digital technologies contribute to shaping the work and lived experiences of everyone, of architects and designers and artists in very specific ways. In addition to that, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and robotics are domains where the organization of labor, the constitution of gender, and the environment are actively being reconfigured. So my own work is aligned with that sort of, or is motivated by questions aligned with that sensibility. For example, how to see technological practices in architecture and design, which are my home fields, as culturally, geographically, and historically situated. In other words, how to provincialize the digital, how to challenge the notion that adopting these technologies is a one-way process, right? Something that takes us from the past to the future, so to speak, or conversely, between province and metropolis. How to complicate those narratives. How to move beyond debates on the role of digital technologies in architecture and design that represent these technologies as inexorable forces that trigger these all-encompassing historical turns. And how to resist sort of reinscribing those narratives in sort of kind of in other master narratives or master accounts of the digital. I think that's really important. How to make the politics and the poetics of the digital available for critical scrutiny and creative inquiry. So these are the questions, or some of the questions, that I explore in my book, Builders of the Vision, that focuses on documenting and identifying the emergence of a technological imaginary of design. And it looks specifically at the inception of numerical control and computer-aided design technologies, at CAD systems, in the context of research, interdisciplinary research projects in laboratories at MIT between 1949 and 1970. So instead of focusing on describing the technologies themselves, I try to pay attention to the discourses about design and the discourses about creativity that start to develop around these technical infrastructures that were developed, as we know, by a combination of engineers, mathematicians, architects, and designers in other fields. And this, I think it's an important element to keep in mind in the context of critical computation. How to understand the intellectual and material histories of technologies needs to be part of the conversation when we think about the future and when we envision the past as well. I'm also involved in a number of collaborative and interdisciplinary projects, for example, with Andres Urbano, who was part of this series as well. I co-edited a special issue of the ARC journal called Other Computations, which I mentioned because I think it is aligned with the topic of the conversation as well, because it explores computational design practices in architecture outside of the quote unquote global north, right? So it tries to challenge Anglo and Eurocentric understandings of architectural and design innovation. And it combines the work of 8 incredible scholars working on histories and ethnographies of computational approaches to architecture and design, as well as a review of architectural projects by Southern scholars and practitioners from places like India, Colombia, Trinidad, Costa Rica, Brazil, and so on. So just some kind of spreads. and I want to kind of mention the work of a couple of scholars in this volume, in this issue, because I think they align with our conversation today. The work of US-based Trinidadian scholar Vernell Noel is of particular interest. She draws from a rich ethnographic and design study of the craft of wire bending in Trinidad and Tobago, to lead us to kind of imagine new ways to bring craft and computation together. So she looks ethnographically, but also through design experiments and computational design experiments at how these techniques of wire bending may be reimagined, appropriated by new constituencies. And she proposes a series of principles to speculatively guide the development of technologies in close connection with cultural practices. It also includes the work of Indian architectural historian Megha Chand Inglis, who looks at the work of temple builders and CNC factory workers in London and India, and Ahmedabad in India, showing how these kind of conventional distinctions between manual work and digital work, or between tradition and future that we are inundated by all the time, are more interesting and more complicated than that, and that it's difficult to kind of trace the messy modernities at play in contemporary architectural and design production if we rely on those simplistic dichotomies. The work also of my colleagues David Sperling, Pablo Herrera, and Rodrigo Shirin in the issue looks at a number of recent projects in Latin America that incorporate digital fabrication technologies, and interestingly look at recent literature in STS and post-colonial studies to explore different configurations of the digital in Latin American architecture and design. So from Fab Labs to the emergence of digital craft communities, emphasizing hacking and other bottom-up strategies. Another element that I think it's important to mention here in my work is that I am really interested in developing cross-disciplinary research and pedagogical frameworks, and I think that's something that we all share in the panel. Frameworks that, in my case, address questions about architecture, design, and the built environment. And a concept that I'm really interested in, that I put at the center of my effort as an educator and as a scholar, is the concept of critical technical practice, which has been formulated by a number of scholars, including Phil Agri. And this is very connected to my work as a co-director of the Computational Design Laboratory at Carnegie Mellon, which is a place where we aim at reimagining the role of computing in the design and production of the built environment. And in this laboratory with my students and my collaborators, one thing we're trying to do is to connect or bridge an experimental disposition towards design and technology with historical, critical, and artistic modes of inquiry and reflection. This part, for example, as the PI of the project Rethinking Automation in Construction, I'm working with colleagues in the Robotics Institute, as well as in industry, and with students in the PhD, MS, and undergraduate programs in my school to advance, to foster a vision for the future of construction that does not aspire to full automation, but instead at robotically supported cooperative construction. We have received support from the Pennsylvania Agency for Economic Development, and we're exploring the potential of reinforcement learning techniques to facilitate more adaptive and more resilient approaches to robotically supported construction. There's an article coming out in Acadia this year that reports on some of the most recent developments in this project, which I'm very excited about. Another project that looks at material practices in conjunction with computational ones is generative fabrication, when we look at the potential of material and device-specific design languages or grammars to act both as machine-readable information but also as platforms for creative design exploration. This, for example, was selected for exhibition at SIGGRAPH 2020 Art Gallery, which is a context that I know many of us are familiar with. It was canceled because of COVID, but it remained as part of the selection and documented in a journal article as part of the IJAC, co-written with Jingyang Liu and Yichin Li, who are my close collaborators in this project. We're also developing what I like to call experimental archaeologies of computer-aided design. And this is a project that I developed in my lab, but also with collaborators in the University of California in computer science and at McGill, where we are looking at new approaches to investigating the history, but also reimagining the future of design technologies through software reconstructions, emulations, and speculations. We've been developing a series of interactive pieces, reconstructing visual, interactive, and ergonomic aspects of some of the earliest computational design systems, using modern software and hardware methods. And the resulting installations aim at offering access to forgotten or lost material, tactile, and technical aspects of the earliest computational design interfaces. So giving us access to distant ways of seeing and designing. This has been exhibited in a number of places in the US and Canada and Germany. And to finalize this very short presentation, I want to mention that one project that sort of brings together these kind of different traits of the work that I do and that I work on with my collaborators is an exhibition entitled There's an Imaginaire Numérique in Montreal that I am preparing with my colleague Theodora Bardulli, and that will explore the history and contemporary expressions of computational design as an interdisciplinary practice, not just architecture, not just media, arts, and so on, but rather as a sort of interdiscipline that helps us connect questions of the built environment, of creative expression, and of technical import. These are just some images to finalize, and just very quickly, I chose to show these kind of quick projects because they help convey the ambition to reconcile experimental approaches and critical approaches in the context of computing, which I think is crucial to the context of this conversation. But I don't think that these projects necessarily answer all of those questions that I started with. I do think they kind of define a sort of path that we are exploring. And that I think spaces like this conversation, this panel, is an important example of how we may go about finding answers to those questions. With that, I'd like to finish by thanking Gustavo and my fellow panelists, and also looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so very much, Professor Locke. I really appreciate the care and also the extent of what you're researching in your lab. And I look forward to the conversation at the end. Our next speaker is Anu Vikram. And Anu, I guess I met her at a CAA, and then I met her at an ALMAS at UCSB. But where it shines the most is I saw her at one of her exhibitions that she curated at 18th Street Projects. And then I heard about her at that moment, that she was a force of nature, and she was. So take it away.
Wow, thank you so much, Gustavo, and thank you for putting me on this wonderful panel. I'm a little shy, honestly, because I am not a computationist and I am not a computer programmer, and I'm a theorist, I'm a curator. So my understanding of the how is not always the deepest, but my understanding of the why, I think, is really what it's about. And perhaps I can lend a little bit of that to this conversation. So I am privileged to be co-curator with Victoria Vesna, director of the Art Sci Center at UCLA. We are curating the upcoming 2024 exhibition for Pacific Standard Time Art by Science by LA, which is called Atmosphere of Sound, Sonic Art in Times of Climate Disruption. And in that show, which I won't go into today, we are researching currently artists who work with sound specifically not as their exclusive medium, although it can be, but as an important or primary medium to explore what we might consider an ecofeminist milieu. The ideas of humans putting ourselves on the same level as other species, whether they're plant species, animal species, or even rocks, you know, and thinking about how we dismantle the hierarchies that have encouraged us to be cavalier in our stewardship of the environment and of social connections. And so this is really what governs my approach to the subject of AI as well. So I'm going to do something a little bit different today. I am also a writer. I write extensively about contemporary art and technology, as well as race, diversity, and inclusion in institutions. And I am in the process of writing an extended review of the exhibition Beyond the Uncanny Valley, Being Human in the Age of AI, which recently closed at the DeYoung Museum in San Francisco after a little more than a year of being open, unfortunately, during COVID. So this exhibition is really fascinating to me. I think it's a very important show. And let me share my screen. For those of you who are familiar with the canon of contemporary art conceptualism in the late 20th century, you probably know the touchstone, which is the MoMA show of 1970 called Information, which was curated by Kenneth McShine. And that Information show included artists like Hans Haacke, who took a poll, right? That was the famous 1970 MoMA poll where he asked the public to vote on whether they supported or did not support the expansion of U.S. interests into other parts of Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War, right? It was a referendum on Governor Rockefeller at the time's position on further U.S. intervention in Cambodia and Laos. So obviously very hot button political issue in 1970. And I think although it hasn't really been discussed in this way, it's important from my perspective as a historian of exhibitions to put this exhibition by curator Claudia Schmidly in lineage with that 1970 show at MoMA. Because I do think that the way that the artists here are using artificial intelligence is of a piece with how the conceptual artists of 1970 were using information that was also being often gathered from the crowd or gathered from research. So with that, the title of my essay and my presentation today is Uncanny Views, Reflections on the Human in the Age of AI. And one thing that this presentation and my exhibition for PST have in common is that they're both concerned with questions of the post-human. And when I talk about the post-human, I would distinguish that from the transhuman in the sense that many futurists, particularly in the West, identify as transhumanist, and they're interested in using technology to dismantle some of the vital characteristics of what makes us human, such as dying, illness, defecation, eating, right? All of these bodily functions and bodily limitations that we have are very much a focus, not the only, but a focus, life extension, what have you, of people who are invested in futurism. Interestingly, also gender transition plays a role there, and the possibility of exploring more experiences through physicality, through different technologies. So it's fascinating space. But what differentiates transhumanism from posthumanism, in my view, and in the view of theorists like Haraway or Rosie Braidotti, is the feminist and critical race studies bent, which is to say that we need to really ask ourselves what we even think the human means before we can transcend it. So that's a lot of my focus critically, and it's what I'm going to talk about today. Now, this exhibition does take up this question to some extent of what is it to be human. And the exhibition includes all these artworks that really present us with variations on that concept of what it is to be human. But what's interesting about it to me from a critic's point of view is that for whatever reason, which may be institutional, that question is not foregrounded in the description of the exhibition and what it's really supposed to be about. It's very much about how do we understand consciousness from a computational point of view, and how are the artists using information and information processing to create visions, audio and visual and physical installations that are aesthetic. So aesthetics is a big part of this question, right? What is the uncanny aesthetic? And I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but let me just start with the facts. Claudia Schmidly is the curator in charge of contemporary art and programming at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. She's been there since 2016. She came from Europe. She was appointed to oversee programming at both the de Young and the Legion of Honor. And they're very different institutions, right? The de Young is a very modern, it's a recent building, right? Herzog and de Meuron? I hope I didn't say that wrong. And then the Legion of Honor is a neoclassical building, and it has a Baroque collection of art, right? So there's a Wangechi Muchu show at the same time at the Legion of Honor, which is interesting because it expresses a post-human Black womanist perspective. They haven't, again, been linked, but I can see how the curator is thinking about the two things at the same time. I thought that was really interesting. Now, who pays for these things? I think that's a huge question when it comes to any large-scale computational endeavor, right? And in this case, it's a mix of private foundations, which are family foundations, as well as organizations like the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts and the Transformations of the Human program at the Berggruen Institute, which I've also been involved with as a contributor. Last year, I contributed a piece to the Los Angeles Review of Books that was commissioned by that same project called, oh my gosh, what was it called? An ethic of caring beyond the human, which I'm happy to share with folks as a link. So connecting these ideas, which my essay, for example, is very much about these questions that we're exploring in the Atmosphere of Sound show. How do we relate to non-human species? How do we relate to climate crisis from a computational, artificial intelligence oriented point of view? What is consciousness? Who is human? And then we also see corporations. Deutsche Bank is here, and also then a technology company. So we see the investment that's coming from industry into this question, which is why it's being foregrounded, right? There's so many questions we could be asking. Obviously, we really want to know about AI, but I do think it's really important to talk about how specifically in the Bay Area museums, this relationship between tech as an industry and institutions that are presenting critical views on tech is very close. And then commercial galleries, Marion Goodman and also Gladstone are contributed to the exhibition. And then finally, in terms of premise, the exhibition takes as a given the topic of Masahiro Mori's 1970 robotics paper on the Uncanny Valley. Notable that that paper comes out in 1970, the same year as the information show, right? So in a certain way, we're talking about a whole new space, but in another way, we're actually still talking about the same era of thinking. Animation, animatronics, and art have all used these strategies of identification and estrangement with human-like forms to create convincing likenesses. Critics of Mori's theory argue that it makes researchers fearful of attempting human-like veracity. In my essay, I write about David Hansen specifically, who created the Bina 48 robot, which is in the exhibition, or rather video of it is in the exhibition at the de Young. And he and his team have argued they really are in favor of very humanoid robots, and they've argued that it's a space that's worth exploring. Even if it's a bit strange, there's a lot of benefit and affinity that's also created with humans interacting with humanoid robots. Then there's also the critique that comes from Sylvia Wynter and other racial theorists. So Sylvia Wynter's essay, No Humans Involved, she talks about how the LAPD in 1992, testifying about the Rodney King beating, used in some of the evidence, there was use of a code NHI, No Humans Involved, which referred to the fact that they had only encountered African-American people in the conducting of whatever incident. So she speaks about how, from a legal point of view, African-Americans have never been treated as human. They have been considered 3/5 of human at one point. They are still treated by the law very often as non-human or subhuman. And certainly their interests are treated as somehow anomalous to the needs of the mainstream, the general good. And so how can we truly talk about the Uncanny Valley when in fact many individuals experience every day a kind of Fanonian uncanniness where I experience myself as a human being, but the person sitting across from me sees me as a set of symbols, sees me as a collection of attributes that are other than they, and that those attributes resolve into something that isn't ever really me. I'm always uncanny to myself. And Enling Chang writes about this in Ornamentalism. She talks about how the category of the yellow woman, or yellowness as an idea for Asians, is actually a category that doesn't exist within Asians. It's one that's entirely externally imposed. So in that sense, the way that we experience race as raced bodies, gender as gendered bodies, queerness, and so on, already casts us as uncanny. What then is the uncanny valley? What is our relationship to humanness and approximations thereof? And so finally, human expectations of likeness and submissiveness are anchored in bias. So let's talk about that a bit. So how is AI being used in art? Well, here we see three different ways in which it's being approached. And these are really broad buckets and they kind of cross over. One is generative. Algorithms are processing stimulus data to create imagery and sound. Another is aggregate. The neural nets are searching for information and they're synthesizing it into their aesthetic output. So there's some kind of consolidating, some kind of compiling happening. And then finally we have predictive, which means that based on the generating and then the aggregating, we get new variants that are iterative, that are approximating a human-like consciousness. So here's some examples of the generative, Zach Bloss and Ian Chang. So Zach has taken a variety of stimulus information. His project connects the Doors, the band, with Aldous Huxley and psychedelic culture, with neotropics, which are like smart drugs, as well as microdosing hallucinogens that is very popular in the technology community in Silicon Valley as part of this kind of life extension, life optimization phenomenon. And so he's created this environment where the sounds and also the video are generated by algorithms that are processing stimulus data that's coming from information about, the music of the Doors, the poetry of Jim Morrison, the writings of Aldous Huxley, the different ingredients in the neotropics, and so on. Then we also have Ian Chang. Ian Chang has actually created what he considers to be a digital artificial life form. He calls it BOB, Bag of Beliefs. It's this kind of chain string form that you see on the large monitors in the image on the right. And it lives in a simulated environment where it eats and it has metabolism and it processes food and it sleeps and it rests and it gains health points and is kind of like a Tamagotchi of sorts, right? Where you have to cultivate it, make sure it's cared for. And so he's essentially eliminated the humanoid form from this life form, which I think is really interesting. And poses questions, right? How far away from human likeness can we get and still accept something as a potentially living being? What does human likeness look like? Does it have to look facially, visage-like a human being? Or can it be because this digital life form has metabolism, it has energy, it needs to rest, right? So when we look at those health points, we see ourselves, not only sort of the video game world that it resembles, but also the world of the quantified self. Again, going back to personal optimization and this trend of life extension within the transhumanist community. So aggregate here, I'm talking about Agnieszka Courant, who has been collaborating with biologists and termites. So she fed the termites a diet of crystals and other minerals that enabled them to produce mounds, but the mounds that they produced are pigmented and they're sparkly and they're really quite beautiful. I wish I had a closer photo to show you, but I wanted to give you the overview. So this is a collaborative work with a swarm intelligence. That's basically the idea, these swarm intelligence here being termites. There's another work in the show by Pierre Huyghe, which is more of a symbolic swarm intelligence incorporating bees outside in the garden. But Courant is actually collaborating with the termites in a way that is then being replicated by other forms of combination crowdsourced and artificially processed information. So she works with Mechanical Turk workers and uses their micro labor to identify animals in images that come from the internet. And so the trick here is really the question is raised, and I'm going to try to approach it from two different angles. What is a reliable way to deal with data sets? We know that human beings put their own biases into the data sets that they provide, whether they're collected from them without their knowledge or with their only very provisional knowledge, or whether it's them directly selecting and assigning images that they see. They're always going to work from their own bias. The beauty of a computerized system, computational system, is that it eliminates that bias from the reviewer itself, which is the computer. Everything is ones and zeros to the computer. The computer doesn't care. But because the data set is itself biased, then the frequency will actually augment the bias. So if more bias is apparent, then the AI will generate even more bias because bias is already appearing with a high frequency. So human beings are unreliable and AI is also unreliable. What is the right way to produce an unbiased data set? We really don't seem to know. So Lynn Hirschman-Leeson is taking it from another perspective. She's talking about our data bodies. And if you're not familiar with the idea of the data body already, I think Critical Art Ensemble were the first to coin the term. Back around the time of my MA thesis, I think I cited their Flesh Machine. And I actually was writing at that time about how we were already starting to be asked to trade our personal information for access as as consumers and citizens. And this was before Facebook or Instagram, these different data mining techniques that we're now quite familiar with. But what this project called Shadow Stalker addresses is how every one of us has a digital footprint. And so this monitor, which is part of a larger installation, takes the physical outline of each viewer in the exhibition space and shows you what is readily accessible on the internet as information about you as your data body. So for example, it shows that you're at the de Young Museum right now, and then below that it'll show, you know, all your known addresses, and she's blocked out the key information, but it's quite clear, you know, if you're looking at your own data portrait, it's absolutely your own personal information being reflected back at you, publicly available, spiderable in a matter of seconds as you move through the exhibition space. So the Shadow Stalker, which is also a 10-minute short film that is available on YouTube, and I'll drop a link to that in the chat when I'm done speaking, so you all can watch it. It's a great little film that explores what the Red Square, which is this kind of data body collector that follows us around the internet, what it is, what it does, and why we need to be concerned about it. So then I'm briefly going to talk about predictive. Stephanie Dinkins, this project is ongoing with Bina 48. So I mentioned Bina briefly. She was created by Hanson Robotics. She is a humanoid smart robot. She is the likeness of Bina Rothblatt, who is an African-American woman, and she has a data set that's compiled of thousands of hours of interviews with Bina about her views in her personal life. So she's meant to be a portrait of one person. Dinkins became interested in this robot because she wanted to know whether the robot could understand itself as a human being who was raced. Again, it's all ones and zeros to the robot. So what does it mean that she has the face and the history of a Black woman? And Dinkins asks her some very pointed questions that are very specific, like, who are your people? Which is a question that the AI parses one way, but which a Black American person would immediately understand to mean, who do you come from? Are you from the South? Are you from Texas? Are you from California? You know, what's your story? Are you from the Caribbean? Who are your people? Who claims you, right? Who claims Bina? Who are her people? Do the people claim Bina, right? This couple, this transhumanist couple, Bina and Martine Rothblatt, they claim Bina as their own. They own her, they've created her, they've invested her with these stories. And it is a kind of a life extension, right? Martine Rothblatt claimed that she was creating this effigy because she never wanted her wife to die. And so there are a lot of gaps, right? Because Bina doesn't have a very big data set. It's just one person. So she's constantly flubbing in that way that AIs do, where they talk to you like my 5-year-old does when he's telling me a lie. Right? It sounds plausible until you probe it just a little bit harder. And then she redirects. And it's interesting to watch, but it's definitely not a sort of manifestation of a Black consciousness. So Stephanie Dinkins moved on from this to also trying to create her own manifestations of a Black artificial consciousness with bigger data sets, interviewing larger numbers of African Americans about their stories, and then creating objects, including one that's in the exhibition, that tells their stories. in the first person through an invented aggregate narrator. It's predictive. So it's not their original stories told verbatim, it's instead new stories generated from the patterns that those original stories have produced. And then I want to talk a little bit about Lawrence Leck. So the work that's in the show is called Idol, A-I-D-O-L, and that too, it's a feature-length film. It is available on Vimeo. I can also share that link in the chat. It's quite beautiful. This still is actually from his work called Sino-Futurism, which is related. And I want to talk about Sino-Futurism for a moment. This is a theory that Leck has introduced. He himself is a Singaporean Chinese German artist. He was born and raised in Germany. His parents were employees of Lufthansa who immigrated from Singapore to Germany in order to work for the airline. So they were engineers. They were also international residents, citizens, and Leck grew up in this hybrid cultural space. He also got his degrees in the UK, and so now has this triangulated British, German, Singaporean, Chinese identity, right? Maybe quadrilated identity. So thinking about Afrofuturism and how Afrofuturism posits that the very absences in the record of the dominant white culture that African Americans experience and African cultures experience is in itself a mode of futurism, right? Sees what is a lack and make it into an asset. It's very Warholian in a sense. And so Leck says, well, Sino-Futurism is Asian Americans, Chinese Americans are so often viewed as being emotionless, as being model minorities, as being robot-like, tireless workers who can be ground into the ground, right? What if that's our futurism? What if that affectlessness, tirelessness, transhumanness is actually the framework of our own futurism? And forgive me, I'm doing this so sketchily. I really encourage you to read about his theory, which is extensive. But I think it's fascinating, again, from that same perspective of reading Anling Chang. And how do we rethink these categories that are forced on us in a way that can be emancipatory? And so then a couple more questions I want to ask, and I promise I'm almost done here, is who makes data? So Hita Steyrl, with her Broken Windows, City of Broken Windows project, thinking about two forms of the ideas of broken windows theory. One from the 1890s, which says that a cycle of boom and bust in which communities are built up and then defunded, and then they become ghettos, and they're destroyed and demolished, and then they're refunded and gentrified. This is in the 1890s, right? Post the recreation of Paris. And he's saying that this is a total waste of time and money, and it doesn't actually produce any long-term benefit. And then the other side of broken windows is the broken windows policing theory, which is from, I think, the 1960s or 70s, which obviously took hold in the 80s and 90s and the 2000s, and says that even the smallest infraction in the urban landscape, like a broken window or graffiti, has to be maximally punished in order to deter more serious forms of crime, which has been a justification for what has turned out to be very racist deployments of the law and really disproportionate arrests of African Americans and people of color and so on, right? So Steyrl is really so interested in data, right? Steyrl also writes about, in Duty-Free Art, how data becomes its own determinant. So everything, she has this analogy where she says, Booz Allen Hamilton consultants were reviewing these data about a luxury hotel in the UAE. And everything they ran showed them that one of the groups that they would be interested would be this very affluent group of 17 to 21-year-olds who would pay for a luxury hotel. And they just kept dismissing it as anomaly, because these guys come from the military consulting world, and they assume that all of the young people in the Arab world are disaffected, poor people of the streets, the uprising, whatnot. They don't see the rich Arabs who are young, who constitute a new leisure class, and they just kept missing this. And it turned out, of course, that those people really do exist, and that the data was correct, and it was the human beings interpreting the data who were applying their own bias, and missing that. But the fact is that the way that dominant culture works is anything that doesn't fit the pattern that the dominant culture establishes is called an anomaly. And so if you're constantly anomalous, it kind of doesn't matter how many diverse faces you put in the room if they're all anomalous every time that they don't align with the patterns of thinking that already exist. We see this in academia all the time, right? We see this in corporations. It's why it's so hard to get diversity at the highest levels of any organization. It's because you filter people out because they don't want to do things the way you already do them and think the way you already do, and they don't have the credentials and the visibility that you have, right? So we all know this is true. She talks about it in the algorithm. She talks about it in this installation. And then Trevor Paglen shows us this is what the data set looks like. These, again, are people who have been selected by other people anonymously to represent the people who should be added to a data set for surveillance, right? And so there's not that many Black women in the set. Overall, there's not enough proportional representation of every population in the set, right? There's all these ways in which the selections don't quite align with the population. And so the thing is that all of this is really presented in the exhibition, but it's so much information that I think it's really easy for the human being viewer to get total information overload and stop parsing all these nuances of what they see. I certainly did, right? So I promise I'm wrapping now. Who is human is the last question. Forensic architecture deals with this in terms of where tear gas canisters have been deployed against democracy protesters in Hong Kong, in Syria, in Palestine, and elsewhere, and tracing that to connections with museum funding, which is a big part of what I want to talk about too, right? This project, Triple Chaser, was created for the 2018 Whitney Biennial, 2019. The critique of the then Vice Chair of Whitney, Warren Kander's involvement with a company called Safariland that was producing these Triple Chaser canisters and using them on the US-Mexico border. The border agents were using them there, right? Forces were using them against protesters in the West Bank, etc. And this second video in the exhibition then deals with more recent evidence and working directly with human rights groups to collect that evidence and use machine learning to identify where these kinds of weapons are being used illegally so that those human rights groups actually have more evidence. So I think to what Professor Locke was presenting, architecture, radical architecture has a huge important role to play here because data architecture, physical architectures do align in so many ways. And then these on the ground questions come up in the data set as well. Finally, I want to talk about Martine Sims. This is her personal assistant named Teeny from the work called Mythic Being. And Teeny is coded female, right? Like Siri or Alexa, the personal assistants that we will accept, or my parents' GPS back in the 90s, the early 2000s rather, which they used to call Chachi for auntie, right? Why? Why are they all women? Because we're supposed to be subservient. Why, Hansen went on to make Sophia the robot. And why is Sophia the robot also a woman, right? It's because she will be more effective as a caregiver than a male coded android, because people will accept her, they'll listen to her, they won't have as many fights with her, right? There's evidence that suggests that men won't listen to a direction service that's said in a male voice, I guess, except when it's Batman, right? So there's this funny way that Martine's playing with this. The assistant is hostile. She's not a friendly, helpful assistant. She'll curse you out. And she talks about being used and leveraged in a way that is very thinly veiled commentary on how artists are treated in the art world, right? How as a Black artist, she's caught between rich people and white people. She has to use her sexuality as a female artist in a way in order to be visible in certain spaces, right? It's all in the project somewhere. But again, it's all really hard coded in there, right? You've got to spend the time with it and pull it out. And if you were to flip through the exhibition in a kind of a typical way where you spend like an hour and you check all this out, you'd be like, wow, AI is so fascinating. I don't really know that much about it, but it's cool. So you have to read the examples. I mean, there's a wonderful reader that's in here too. I'm sorry this has been all over the place, but it's really because I'm still trying to write this. And these are all the themes that I'm thinking on, and they're huge. So I hope this has sparked some good conversation and insight for later. And it'll be out later this year in print in the spring. And by then I hope it'll be a little more coherent than what I've presented today. But, as you can see, the discussions about AI, they're ongoing, that artists are starting to pick up on. are, really the core questions about who we are as a species and who we're going to be from here on out. Thanks. I'll conclude there.
Well, thank you very much. I know really thorough. Every time I see and hear your lectures, they're thorough and complete. So I'm very thankful. Next up is Andrew, very quickly. Andrew. And then after Andrew's presentation, we're going to lead with Daniel, if he's still available, because he has another meeting to go to. But let's take it away, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, it's a genuine pleasure to be here today. And I'd like to thank you, Gustavo, for so thoughtfully selecting the remarkable panelists whose just sort of texture and detail of their presentations just gives us a lot to talk about. And perhaps in contrast, I'm going to provide something that's a lot more of an overview. And in contrast to that texture and detail, it might be appear a little clumsy, but I hope that in fact, the distance and overview that I present might actually sharpen some of the stakes of what we're addressing. Just really briefly about me. I'm the professor of history and theory of media at CalArts in the School of Critical Studies. I teach dedicated in the MA in Aesthetics Politics program, but I also collaborate quite often with the Art and Tech program. My own history is as a community organizer, but then spending a lot of time within queer anarchism, which I take to be a ruthless critique of all authority, not only anti-Blackness and capitalism, but things like the family. And I work intellectually as a critic, but also as a theorist. And my interests are in formal experimentation of the post-avant-garde as it connects or is influenced by the revolutionary perspective of radical politics. My first book was on the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze and trying to re-understand his critiques of the digital age. But I also have a book in the spring that will speak perhaps more to the themes of today. It's called A Guerrilla Guide to Refusal, and it's on techno-anarchist anonymity, queer disruption, and Black insurgency. I have also been working considerably recently on the history of cybernetics, especially as it influences the way in which we understand mid-century computation and how it informs a lot of today's understanding of social models, models of social thinking, and how they influence political change. So in terms of the theme for today, which is inclusivity, I'm very invested in the stake of inclusivity and in institutions, but also as an anarchist critic of institutions, I'm also as interested in opposition or even exodus as it might drive a system change and primarily to benefit the most oppressed in the world, who are the people who I care the most about, rather than, let's say, people at the height of the institutions, those driving a lot of the technological change in Silicon Valley, or even the progenitor of computation and AI. So where do we find ourselves today? Well, I would say, first, I want to say computation defines the latest period of technique. Humans, as well as all life, as Anu so brilliantly said, has been technical. So, space has been territorialized through birdsong as much as architecture. We and all other forms of life build belonging through sharing of food or other practices. And, we make worlds as we come to live our dreams and imaginations. And so our current technical era is one of ubiquitous computing, which is not to say that all and every people have equal access to computers. There's still a very strong digital divide, but computers have increasingly come to saturate everyday life as a technical way of engaging in our social worlds. And one of the challenges is that computation has so many polyvalent uses that it's hard to generalize about it. And so sometimes we need to sort of step back to understand its sort of broader consequences, because its use cases can be so open-ended, it feels like just about anything is possible. So here are a few stories, though obviously a limited set, some of the stories that we tell about computation. The first, perhaps the most prevalent by users, but there are also many deeply invested in the story, is that computation is a set of neutral tools. It's said to be infinitely flexible, defined solely by its use, and if we don't like one of the use, one can simply invent a new and a different one. Media, as well as technology studies, tends to push back quite vehemently against this. And we ask the question instead, what are the capacities? What are the affordances of certain technologies? Because they're not infinite. And in fact, they will always benefit some uses over others, though, like I said previously, they're often rather open-ended. And so one of the hard determinist stories, which is to say a second story we tell, is one that comes from the great German materialist media theorist Friedrich Hitler, who would remind us that at every instance, all technological advances have been driven by the military. And I suppose there may be some in the audience who might find that neutral or even positive, but in general, Hitler means it as a critique. We should take the military advances as being at the cutting edge of technology as a challenge that we have to always confront, in that their first and most purposeful use is violence. And we can imagine that the early use of computers actually were to deliver violence at a distance. This is where the cybernetics history that I've been doing really makes it clear. Some of the earliest work in computation was on anti-aircraft systems trying to shoot down planes. And this might not be hard-coded in every use, but it's strange or maybe easy to find out once we start looking at it at the ways in which visualization happens through object character recognition, or even other forms of AI still perhaps having some of this encoded legacy. One of the other stories that we tell, sometimes a hopeful one, is that computation is related to the counterculture. This has been documented quite extensively by Fred Turner in his Cyberculture to Counterculture, but also the classic essay, Californian Ideology, in which we have deep questions about how the internet tells these stories of freedom, but what freedom is it? Is it a libertarian freedom? Is it a freedom tied up in techno fixes to social issues? But there are interesting things, especially in the arts context in which we're discussing today, where earlier Fluxus-related theorists and artists like Alison Knowles actually combined with early IBM scientists to create concrete poetry, or even how anthropologists like Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson came to promote ecological thinking as we know it in early conferences with cyberneticians and people working in what would become the digital. So that sets a bit of the groundwork. So where do I see us today? I would say that we live in a very challenging time. In addition to the climate crisis, which is on every headline right now, we also live in an unparalleled era of inequality. I'll just say this another time because I think it's fundamentally the problem that we have to face today. We live in an unparalleled era of inequality. If we want to quantify it, we have a wealth divide that is at least as great, if not deeper, than the Gilded Age, which is the era of robber barons, in which things were so fundamentally challenging that America keeps telling itself that it's not that anymore, but here we are once again. Globally, it's even worse. There are some raises in the quality of life, perhaps, but it's challenged even more by global slums, billions of people who are out of any formal work in which there's no plan to ever have them, and so-called modernization projects, which are completely upending people's traditional ways of life and subsistence living that has no clear path for them to actually improve the quality of existence. And computation certainly has played a major part in this. It has automated, which is to say, take technical, which both routinizes and obfuscates a lot of these processes, sort of insulating them from criticism and making it easier for certain actions to occur, while making it much more difficult to challenge from a social, or let's say, a grassroots perspective. So in terms of technology, I think it's important for us to question both motivations and consequences. So I'd say a lot of the technology that we have to confront in this unparalleled age of inequality is designed with certain worlds in mind, which is not to say that all of them come true, nor that there aren't other worlds that are unlocked by unruly or other users. But here are a few of those worlds or those principles. First is complexity and stability. And this is really initially a sort of a neutral standpoint. Our infrastructure, industrial manufacturing, but also geopolitical power politics are defined by the technology that we have today. But the stability, both as a benefit to reliability, can also be a challenge because it makes it that much harder to confront, like we see in the world of oil and gas today. Moreover, as Ruha Benjamin has so expertly identified, we live in an era of a new Jim Code in which social relations, in particular anti-Blackness, is encoded within technical systems that make them more resilient to criticism or change. We also see a recomposition of labor. There have been numerous studies on this, but two really excellent recent books include Gavin Mueller and Jason Smith's book on manufacturing, in which they note how a lot of the techno-optimistic discourses that we see today are actually management discourses used to control and manipulate labor, And so if we were to challenge or think of what a good relationship to labor within the digital context would mean, we might actually return to the Luddites or others who challenge technology and advances in technology. And lastly, we live in this era in which everything is defined by networked communication, which has many positives, but I think that we're seeing this growing, what people call a techlash, as in a backlash against technology, which people are questioning both behavioral modulation that comes with it, just to say a unquestioned profit motive, as well as forms of social engineering that make it difficult because they're existing on a system level, as well as a sort of incomprehensible security risk and surveillance, not just to people, but in more vulnerable states, such as in the Middle East or in authoritarian countries, that human rights activists are having every day and every conversation that they engage in monitored through spyware, malware, and other techniques. And lastly, I would say that the general approach that I think is important, that we don't just see that it's a question of bias or use, is that we need to understand the technology encodes social relations. And here, I think it's still quite important to turn to Wendy Chun's canonical essay on the persistence of visual knowledge, in which she looks at things as basic as the command in the command line and running commands actually came from early use of computations in which an army officer, a male army officer, would command a woman at the levers of a computer in order to operate it. And so there are ways in which all of these things, including master and slave, which fortunately we're moving against beyond a little bit, are deeply encoded within even the technical systems we use beyond even question. So where does this leave us? I don't want to sort of drag on too long. Personally, my approach is not to judge technology. I don't see very much in the moral condemnation to say it's bad and to simply withdraw from it or say that we need to sort of wholesale get rid of it. But instead, I think it's important to see ways to appropriate and reutilize these technical systems with an understanding that so many of them, the landscape and ecosphere in which they're built, was created to build worlds that are not the one that we want to live in. So one historical model that I've been working on recently has been tactical media. It's quite popular in the 1990s. I would say it doesn't really sort of exist as such anymore. And what it was a group of unruly users who wanted to turn technology against its forefathers, which is, here, not unlike Haraway's infamous Thomas on the Cyborg, which was built from a military medical complex and perhaps tried to get outside of it, but had to understand what its roots were. And tactical media is a sort of collaboration between artists, activists, hackers, programmers, and others who used newly available consumer technologies to move it towards decolonial, queer, feminist, and anti-capitalist ends. I think one of the challenges for something like tactical media is that it was built on stories of openness and participation, imagining that if technologies were just moved in a more open or a more participatory direction, that it would be a form of liberation. But especially through essays like Tiziana Terranova's Free Labor, Nick Cernick's Platform Capitalism, or Brian Jordan Jefferson's Digitize and Punish, I think that we see that more computation or just sort of more technical approaches that perhaps have a greater quotient of openness or more participation, in fact, have been utilized by everything from capitalist platforms, smart cities, other initiatives to recreate the social conditions, not even deepen them through forms of exploitation or oppression. So it means we need to rethink what those social conditions are, what it would mean for there to be dissident users, and understand new principles for liberatory action. A few programs that I've liked and collaborated with in a variety of ways recently have been the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, which is a Skid Row-based organization of everyday people looking to see the way in which the LAPD uses technology, everything from things to surveil phone conversations to their data systems and their other mining, and coming up with community-based advocacy platforms in order to push back against it. The older Crypto Party, which I think isn't as vibrant right now, but teaches people everyday security practices to keep yourself safe and allow protesters to act with more capacity. Groups like Hacking and Hustling, pushing back against the criminalization of various online activities for things like sex work, or the Our Data Bodies Project, which looks at the way in which Black and other people's bodies are made into data to make them easier to criminalize. So these are just a few today, but I'm so grateful to be able to present these perspectives, to understand what the stakes are for radical politics, and to be in conversation with such people. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you, all of my panelists. Dr. Locke needs to go very quickly, but I just wanted to make sure, I just wanted to open the floor to him first to see if he had any comments or questions so we can continue the dialogue.
Thank you, Gustavo. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you especially to my fellow panelists for such incredible presentations. I was taking notes and learning from all of you. And I apologize again for this other thing that I need to run into. I will say just a few things. I was very thrilled to hear Anu, is it okay? Anu's conceptualization of this landscape of AI in art practices through this lens, through this taxonomy of prediction and generativity and aggregation. I think that's a very productive framework that I think resonates with a lot of the stuff that we're doing here, and I look forward to learning more about that review that you're writing. I think it's going to be wonderful. One thing that I wanted to, I'm going to say a few quick things, and then I'm going to disappear, and I apologize for that. Andrew, I also appreciated so much the conversation that you started. I was taking notes about some of the materials that you were discussing. Some of them I know, because I'm also kind of an STS person. Some of them I didn't, and I look forward to entering more into that and into your own work, which sounds really wonderful. And Joan, one thing that I was excited and thrilled to see in your presentation was like how interesting it is that you are positioning yourself within this context of sort of cultural and technical sort of practices in a way that sort of makes scientific advancements available for interpretation and for aesthetic kind of enjoyment. And I think there's something really powerful there that I think some of my own work aspires to as well. And I'm just mainly very grateful to everyone, and I apologize again for having to disappear. I really wish I could stay in the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much, Professor Locke. Well, I guess just wanted to say thank you very much, Andrew, again for your thoughts. Thank you, Anu, and thank you, Professor Marin. I guess, how do we start this? Because there's so much that was presented to unpack. I guess I want to start maybe with Andrew, because I think Andrew has really kind of focused my understanding of critically looking at computation and where we are in our age, and what computation has given and what we have lost. So I guess I would say, Andrew, how do you see us moving forward critically with this new tool? Or how should we maybe approach art or these type of practices of resistance with a computational tool moving forward?
I mean, no better way than with the other panelists in the way they've presented their work. You know, I think that for me, there's a myth busting process, just sort of get past some basic assumptions that I think motivate some people's work and lead them to make compromises. Maybe they don't need to or don't have to. And some of it is to think that, you know, some of these huge mega corporations really have our best interests in mind. Like, certainly we should push Google or a Facebook to make changes, and when they're willing to offer resources, perhaps consider them and what strings are attached. You know, I'm not a purist in that sort of regard, but I think that the world that we want to live in will not be created by them. And so it's absolutely important for these other pockets and other spaces, whether it be people in academia, sometimes in the art world, though, of course, we know that there's so many challenges and compromises in the art world as well. But that to look outside the thought leaders and the people who wield so much power and influence, not as people who are going to aid us as much in the process, but as people who that, you know, you can engage in critically and selectively, but that the stakes of the future are really in believing in each other, believing in people of color-led resistance, looking to global places and global responses, and looking at experimental, unexpected, and artistic approaches that can free our mind and that will, propose other new paths. And, I'm afraid this is a bit too broad or vague. And so I'd love to hear from the other panelists to still expand and see where the connections are and to see what makes them sort of hopeful and things that they love engaging in or thinking of, things that maybe even move from critique to world building or other futures. There's a lot in so-called criminal justice reform right now. We at CalArts in the fall had a really wonderful opportunity to have Brian Jordan Jefferson there, someone who studies the political economy of media and technology, to see how it's applied within so-called criminal justice reform. He comes from an abolitionist perspective, and he laid out these stakes that I see very clearly. He says he sees the future of criminal justice reform with someone like Kamala Harris is going to be perhaps some decarceration, taking people out of cages, but increasing supervision. And the forms of digital technologies that we have allow that to happen with greater ease and efficiency. So you're going to see more people who are system involved, but they're going to be out on various forms of parole and monitoring through ankle bracelets, checking in with parole officers, things like that. And so the future that we have that we need to think through is how to not only do decarceration, but also diminish things like monitoring, surveillance, system involved people, and that foundations like the Ford Foundation appear to be allies in this process, but they might only give the half measures that we need. So I'm really excited of like our data bodies or some of these hacker groups or community organizations that understand this. Some of the people pushing against surveillance, right? They're banning surveillance in certain cities. Portland did it. I forget where we are in Los Angeles, but people are doing this in kind of a piecemeal fashion. But for this to continue growing, for abolition and abolitionist futures and the real practices involved in it to really be moving forward. But like I said, I'd love to hear it from the other panelists. What are the futures in the worlds that they're hearing about? What are the ones that they want to live in?
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. Again, it's a pleasure. I would invite Anu or Professor Kuchamarin to respond, or add another provocation.
Well, I'd like to respond because this is definitely what we're up against in the California Nanosystems Institute. I am in there as keeper of the gate. I discuss with my scientists every day, the ethical practices of nanosystems research. We're in the mouth. We have only a few $1,000s under our belt. We're constantly being challenged as to why artists are in such a powerful building. What do we have to offer them? And they go forward not thinking about the ethical ramifications about what they're doing. And for me, it deals with compassion. It deals with coming together as a community and understanding the minds and being very careful about the technologies that we're unleashing right now on the planet. And, when my Japanese Buddhist monk comes to the Alisphere to meditate and sit in the middle of the sphere, I've got very powerful scientists wondering why in the heck people like this are in the building. And it's only to be able to wake people up and to let them understand that time is precious, that life is precious, and that if we don't understand one another as one entity, one being, that there's no difference between all of us. And we really have to control what we're doing with technology. So I agree with what you said, Andrew, Anu, the work that you're doing. These things are very important to be able to challenge the powers that be. And believe me, we're hanging on by a wing and a prayer. I don't know how much longer we can stay within this large institute that I brought to the campus. So we're fighting for everybody. We care much about all of the issues that you're talking about. And we hope that we can bring compassion and caring and understanding back into the world. So that's what I'm going to say. I'll turn it over to maybe Anu would like to talk, and we'll keep the conversation moving forward.
Okay, well, this has provoked so many thoughts, so I might need a minute just to organize them. Something that came up a number of times that I would love to get your read on, Andrew, is Could last summer's Black Lives Matter uprisings in the streets have happened in the same way if not for the fact that COVID made it possible for people to mask in public, right? All of this facial recognition, surveillance, activist busting, you know, proto-COINTELPRO kind of stuff that's going on, right? I mean, it's funny because I start to refer back to these like 60s counterculture ideas about like, you know, G-men and whatnot, and people laugh, but it's like, we're right back there, you know, and all the stuff that we know now about the way that Dr. King or Malcolm X or, you know, all of the Black Panther leaders were surveilled and harassed and assassinated, right? It's not like it's not happening now. There's all these Black Lives Matter leaders mysteriously dying, right? Things are truly still happening in this way. And information about what's happening is becoming shadowier. So like, I feel like my students, for example, my undergrads, you know, they have so much access to information. They're online constantly. But for example, my queer students, they know nothing about queer history. They don't know who their touchstones are, right? I mean, I'm the first person to present that to them a lot of the time. And sometimes they act like, I don't need to know. I had a student, bless her, I think she was really trying to think on her own, and I really commend her for that. But she came out Audre Lorde. Like, as a Black woman, I don't think Audre Lorde goes far enough. And I was like, you know, more power to you. But also, like, you're also, it's like when people say, I don't like the Beatles because their music sounds like everything that's out now. And I'm like, well, yeah, but, you know, they did it first, right? Like, okay, I understand that you have this politics, but you understand that it comes from Audre Lorde, whether you feel like she personally satisfied your emotional need or not. So I think this is fascinating, right? We have more access to information than ever before, and we know nothing about ourselves. And I think this is especially true for marginalized people. We don't know our own stories. I struggle with this, right? I mean, not to get too personal on it, but I do want to note, right, I'm the only woman of color on this panel. I'm the only part-time faculty member on this panel. Those two things are related, right? That our stories aren't supported. I don't have the kind of support to write my next book that I need. I don't have the kind of academic press distribution for my last book that I need. So how are young people, next generation, going to know that I already did this work? And then I don't get cited and someone comes along 10 years later, you know, I mean, and I think it's great. I'm really happy that people are picking this up, but it's happening over and over. I'm seeing things I wrote about and published in Leonardo in 2009 coming up in Legacy Russell's Glitch Feminism, but I'm not there, right? Because she doesn't know. How would she know? Because nobody keeps that history. So I think the very question of archives of knowledge, it's not just about computation. It's about the fact that our knowledge systems, our institutions, the way they're funded, right? I spent years working at Berkeley in the art department in the formerly named Kroeber Hall that is dilapidated and falling apart. And on the other side of campus, I would go hang out with my friends at the Art and Technology Culture Colloquium, and they were in this beautiful building that was built by engineering, and it had, you know, jade panels on the walls, right? Or you go to UCLA where I work now, and where is the best art collection of any of the departments? Well, it's down in South Campus in the sciences, not in the art buildings on the North Campus. So there's so much disconnect and there's so much wealth disparity just in the institutions we're working in. And I consider myself lucky because I have a year-to-year contract in health insurance. So there are a lot more people out there whose voices need to be heard that never get into the room.
That's why we have to challenge it. We have to be right in the mouth. We've got to look at them in the face, and we've got to make sure that they understand the disparities that are happening. As I say, I'm afraid the University of California is going to get completely rid of every part of liberal arts. You got $40 million worth of centers in quantum information processing, in biopacific new materials coming down on us. And we faculty are supposed to raise the funding to keep students going forward. And they're saying, well, why aren't you being more equitable? Why aren't you being more diverse? Well, give us some funding so we can bring students in the door. Allow us to be able to save what we are. I believe the institution is failing. It's crumbling. What I'm trying to do is bring our technology out into the communities, build these things so that people have alternative ways to educate themselves, because the institutions are failing. They are completely failing, and they are not giving us what we need. So I agree with both of you 100%, and I'm very grateful for your work in codifying this and in cataloging this information so that we've got something, you know, to work on. There's those of us that all we do is just like try to be in people's faces, don't have time to even document what we're doing and seeing the disparities. I mean, I'm old enough, I was there in the 60s. I know Malcolm X. I know that those guys were the heroes. People did not understand that back then. And we fought and we thought we won. We didn't win at all. We're back to where we were, and we were probably always there, but it was covered up. And maybe technology makes it easy to cover this up. I don't know. But, you know, I'm there to try to help as much as I can. And I don't know, you know, how we're going to survive, but we've got to keep going forward. I think these kinds of meetings of minds, this is the only way that we're going to do it, if we can come together as a group and try to solve some of these problems. Anyway, you guys might have more to say, but I'm telling you, it's really difficult. It's very difficult to know how to navigate at this point of time. And now, even now that you hear in the University of California, oh, it's all about diversity, it's all about equity, right? But you know, I don't see them really putting their money where their mouth is. Let's just put it that way. Anyway, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, I mean, they are obviously making it clear what they really want because they're refusing to negotiate with the part-timers union.
That's right.
That's the thing is, I mean, I hate to bring it back to this all the time, but you know, when I was growing up in the 70s and the 80s, what I was led to believe, perhaps innocently, was that academia was the counterweight to the corporate behemoth. That would be an alternative way to amass resources, to deploy information, to connect with people. And of course, in the intervening years, it's been so co-opted by corporate interests. And of course, that's what we're seeing even in the public universities that we're lucky to be part of. Sometimes, weirdly, you have more freedom in the private university where the connection to industry is just right there on the table.
I agree with you, because right now the University of California has been privatized. All of the money from the state is taken away from us. And yet and again, they hold all of our intellectual property. You know what I said to UCOP? I said, if you're not going to fund us, then let us become a private institution so that we can do what we need to do. But we're like really stuck at this point right now. And the University of California is in a bad way. You know, we get no funding from the state. We have to pay more money for every student that comes in. We go in the hole every time we take a student in. And yet and again, you know, here we are. So I agree with you 250%. You know, things that people don't like to hear me say, you know, and one of the reasons why the administration's like, oh, could share more, and there she goes again. But, you know, we have to do it. We've got to be there. We have to be a voice, especially those of us that do have tenure, those of us that do have the security to be able to really hit it where it hurts. We shouldn't be sitting on our tenure. We shouldn't become complacent and being, you know, off in our laboratories just doing our own research. We need to come out as a voice to help those of you that are only here on the fringe, that are part-time, that need to have the kind of support that we need. So anyway,
well, thank you very much.
It's getting very
No. I just wanted to say I thank you very much for your honesty in the conversation. I think it's very important to really talk about where we are. And I think one thing that I truly believe is that I had an understanding that studying architecture or following an academic path was, there was job security and that you would have a community that was healthy and purposeful. And even going to CalArts, I found that there was just so many people at risk, not having enough resources or support to do the work that they were meant to do. And that is a shame. And I think that's a lot of what I understand now is my purpose, is to add, to facilitate conversations and to highlight great work and to do great work with others that I believe in and that that we trust each other. But before we move on, I want to invite Professor Marcos Novak. He actually was in our first panel on Monday, and he agreed to join today. He's been following today's conversation closely and throughout the week. So I think he had a few things to say, but if you're not, I'll do a short introduction. Professor Novak, he's a seminal in the field for architecture of virtual reality. He co-published a book called Cyberspace, and I think he will speak a little bit about that. But mostly, he's a director of the Trans Lab. He works at UCSB, and take it away.
Well, hello, and thank you. And actually, I won't speak about any of the things that I've done. I have questions about all the wonderful things that you presented. But first of all, let me thank Digital Futures and Gustavo and Virginia and Marina, if she's part of this as well, in terms of organizing this. And then each of you for these incredibly strong presentations. And also Daniel, who I guess has gone. I have a kind of formulation that I'd like to ask each of you about, which I think each of you have alluded to. So it's not as if you haven't addressed it, but it might kind of be sort of focused, and we can all shed light on it. But I want to start with a kind of thought experiment about it, which has been troubling me about the digital, about computation, about AI, about neural nets, about robotics, which is the sort of acceptance that these things are amplifying. But what are they amplifying? And the thought experiment is this: that at some point, we all have iPhones and laptops and computers. At some point, we're going to have personal robots. And the personal robots will, of course, be able to do things we can't do. And so now I have my personal robot, and my robot and I go to the gym, and the robot is stronger than me. So I say, robot, lift my weights. Which of course is absurd, because I don't go to the gym to strengthen the robot. I go to the gym to strengthen myself, right? There's something that there's a question of what is it that is being amplified. And it ties into, like, all of your presentations were astonishing. Anu, I've heard you present before. It's really quite incredible. And it's really, the whole business about who has support, institutional support and all that. I mean, that's structural injustice and maybe crime that needs to be addressed. But you did mention the post-human, and which is Catherine Hales, and then the transhuman, maybe Max Moore. And I may be alluding to something that could be the allohuman, that ties into things like what Joanne mentioned, compassion and respect and empathy and inclusion and all of those things. So, okay, this is a big, long introduction. Andrew, I think you were the one who mentioned affordances, and maybe that's the way into what I'm really trying to get to. We've seen, and we see throughout Digital Futures and throughout all sorts of things that we're involved in, we see how computation and technology offers affordances that we can't compete with, but that we can benefit from. So that's fine. But now, if you take the notion that what people really need is not only forms, whether it's music or architecture or design or literature or art, but actually to become a better union, just a better society. How might these technologies actually increase human affordances? So as an architect, I can make stranger and stranger buildings. And as an architect, I'm a formalist and I make stranger and stranger buildings. But I'm not confused. The purpose of architecture is not really the building in the end. It's the people who live in it and the cities and the cultures that are made by it. So the question then is, Joanne, I think you mentioned compassion. I think that's part of the answer. And I think each of you mentioned various forms of justice and so on. But how would you take an AI or a neural net or whatever all the other, I won't just list a whole bunch of technologies, but how would you take those And instead of focusing on how to make different media, you focus on making, I'll use better, but I don't mean it morally, I don't mean it in a kind of judgmental way, but to make people thrive better. Let's put it that way. Like, how would you, what database would you give to an AI whose criterion is making thriving better? I think that's kind of a missing component. Anyway, there's probably some more refining that I can do, but I've gone on too long with the framing. So I just want to tease you with that, or invite you or provoke you with that, or whatever it may be.
Maybe that is to train that AI about happiness, to train that AI about celebration, to train that AI about what it means to come together and to be one, and not to forget that, technologies have been with us from the get-go. Sticking that stick in the ground to trace the way the sun moved was the technology, and that using this information in order to be able to understand who and what we are on the planet. I mean, could we train an AI to understand that, and then maybe be more compassionate about what it means to use that technology, which it will become, to enjoy living if it can live, right? And this could be a way it's going to go. And I don't know, because I don't really particularly work with artificial intelligence at this point, and I barely have any intelligence myself. But that would be an interesting thing. I mean, if we just turned all of the AI training to compassion, I guess. Anyway, I'm not going to say anything, because I think Anu and Andrew know much more than I do about this. So I'm going to turn it over to them.
Andrew, I think actually I want to hear what you have to say about this first, because I have a lot of thoughts again, and I need a minute.
Sure. I mean, don't mean to be stubborn. The way I often approach these things is not from a what I might call a blueprinting standpoint, which is to just sort of imagine a like clean slate future, or even just an extension of the present. But I'm deeply invested in notions of critique, which I think mean sort of using technology just as much as a mirror to understand things about ourselves as we currently understand them, which is why I think all the artistic examples that Anu was presenting are so important, because they're more conceptual work rather than, let's say, building a new infrastructure or something like that. The alternative is that I'm very interested in tactical uses of technology, which is to say, using what's already present and repurposing it, knowing that new and different and other things are going to come in the future too. If I had to, which is not really something that I do very much, so it's going to be very abstract and more of like a thumbnail, I would think of, there were these ambitious notions of utopian technology in the 60s and 70s that were about like replacing drudgery. I mean, this goes way back, like Bellamy's, looking backward or whatever, in which was just like labor gets replaced by technology. But I think that itself is a bit of a challenge, because while it has removed certain types of labor, because of the system of capitalism that we live in, like people have to work in order to get a wage, in order to live their lives. And so there are all new forms of drudgery that get invented in turn as well. So for instance, telemarketing is ever present now. And as really excellent journalism and the work of people at UCLA has shown, that it's now done in former colonial countries, because they're people who already knew English or whatever, and so they end up doing it. And so I think one of the challenges for me is, yes, we need to, it's great to extend human capacities in this sort of post-human, like, I don't know, McLuhanite sort of way. There are things that I find convenient, because, AI, for all of its talk of artificiality, I think it's just sort of, I don't know, statistical reasoning or something like that. And it just sort of does shortcuts for me. So like I can talk to my phone and have it schedule something on my calendar, and it's always there and it's easy to use. So we're going to have more of those sort of shortcuts. And it changes the role of, let's say, the secretary, which historically been sort of gendered and all of that. And sure, let's routinize some of that care work. We should even, let's say, routinize all kinds of devalued and feminized and gendered work. But we need to, like everything from the care of people, young people, the infirm, young people, which is to say children. We can even take other forms of judgery, like, I don't know, people who are working minimum wage jobs at McDonald's or whatever, and placing them with, robots that are ordering it for us. We can do all of this. But if all that happens is people then find new forms of low-income work, then it's this cycle that we need to continue. So I think that for me, all these new forms of association and community and everything, but what we have to do is create forms of freedom to happen in the process. They need to be equitable rather than uneven, which is more or less the kind of history of what we've had. And they need to understand the ways in which they either create or amplify new or existing inequalities. And so can we do that? Is that just an issue of structural inequality? Yes, but it also means doing things like, CRT, which is, the huge whipping post right now for everything. But like, it's historically criticized things like Alan Freeman's classic work on discrimination. Once we deal with something like racism or gender inequality as an issue of discrimination, individualizes it, treats it as something that just gets one sort of legal remedy, we can understand that that's what a lot of the controversy and debate over AI is right now too. Oh, it's about bias data, bad data in, bad data out. If we just get better data, we train more data sets with a more diverse group of people, then suddenly, all gets fixed. And I think, the understanding of the structure from a larger sort of social standpoint, then we can really start exploring things. Lastly, sci-fi. I think sci-fi is, and Hollywood actually, strangely, is always ahead of us. They imagine it and then people make it. And so it means returning to someone like Ursula Le Guin or Octavia Butler or someone to imagine like, what were those futures? Yeah. Anyway, I've gone on too long.
Great. So actually that was really helpful because it helped me stir up what it was I was actually trying to say. So there's a few things. One is I wanted to respond to Professor Kuchera-Mirin's idea about craft and technology, because to me that's really the crux of everything, is that this idea that new media somehow transforms the landscape, and because of our rapid computational ability, everything's new and different, is kind of nonsense. And it's very sort of techno-fascist in a certain way. And actually, I mean, human beings are defined by their technologies throughout human history. Anthropologists look at human technologies as evidence of our development from the very moment that anything like a human exists in the record. And certainly there are any number of craft technologies like weaving or ceramics, for example, that directly inform the way that contemporary media and computational technologies physically exist. I mean, even like the way in which fibers are woven into motherboards, right? It's the same technology. And yet we simultaneously see engineering departments be built up and craft departments are eliminated outright, right? Forget even the contemporary arts, which presumes to generate some revenue. I was a graduate student at California College of the Arts the year they dropped and crafts from their name. So there's this bias against, because they're coded feminine, they're coded collaborative, they're coded non-profitable. And so I'm really interested in that, right? What's the feminist history of technology that involves care work? I thought what you were saying, Andrew, was so interesting and also really problematic in a good way, right? Because I love that queer critique of the family space. I teach Schulman Firestone. I'm super into it. And yet I have been in workplace situations where people were approaching me with the expectation that their demand for intellectual labor that I was not free to give was a boon to me because it would free me from the horrible labor of caring for my children. And, I would like for care labor to be something that we all get to do instead of something that we all automate, right? We saw how well that worked out in the Cultural Revolution. So we have to be careful about these utopias, because even our visions of utopias are still mostly created by white cis men. Sorry, they are. And those people don't understand why someone might want to bear a child, right? And so there's a lot there. There's a lot about, again, who's not human and whose knowledge just doesn't count that we don't even consider. And so we don't have systems that value that. I think we're all on the same page. We want to see new systems. We want to see new ways of doing things. We want to use technology to empower, not only ourselves, because we're relatively empowered, but actually those around us that we can influence and inform who don't see and feel their power fully, right? One thing that being in this space has done for me, is that from the start of my professional career in art and technology, I've had access to people like Professor Novak, just in my circle of people that I got to interact with. That has done way more for me than any academic validation, of which there has been little, to say what you're doing matters. You should keep doing it, and so how lovely to see you again, by the way.
It's so good.
So I think, this space creates opportunity, but it's still in a very abstract way, and it's not equally distributed, and it's not equally supported. And now that I've been in it for over 15 years, I can see that lack of support in inequality is not an accident that would be corrected when it was pointed out, but rather is a pattern that's now re-entrenching rather for a whole other generation. And another narrative of, well, sorry, those people just didn't exist even when they were right in front of you. So I think that willingness to overlook all the information that doesn't truck with our existing patterns, right, that I spoke about before, I think that's what it comes down to, is how are we going to stop throwing everyone who's not a corporate-minded person into the neurodivergent category, throwing everybody who wants to work to live instead of live to work into the, not a good culture fit category, right? When we stop doing this, when we stop assuming we know before we see the data, I guess that's my point.
I agree with you. I mean, I think about the fact, I'm Romani. I lived in, I'm a gypsy. We were very poor. And I look at the way my grandma and grandpap lived. And we were in a very small 100 people mining town. And my grandma did crochet for everybody. And my grandpaps did carpentry and grew vegetables in the backyard. And we bartered. We exchanged what we loved to do. We loved how we lived, how we made our money, which didn't deal with money. It dealt with exchange of goods, was our craft. It was our art. It was what we love to do, whether it's to care for children or to churn butter or whatever it is. How can we get back to that kind of culture? How can we get back to that kind of sharing where everyone is happy with the work that they do and it contributes to our world? And there's nothing that's more important than anything else. If you're a caregiver, if you're, a good garbage collector, if you're a good sewer or weaver, or whatever, that all of these things matter, that we can go back to living and doing what we love to do. And that's what a job is. Not having to do something that we don't want to do because of this big factorization, that we've come into this world of 1984, where, you can get everything you want from one factory and you've got to have all these laborers pushing those buttons in order to make that happen. I'm hoping that somehow, the democratization of the internet technology can help us. I don't know that because we are becoming overwhelmed with information, and we are becoming, it's getting out of our control, or has probably been out of our control the whole time. So now I'm not going to say anything. I'm going to open it up to.
Well, I think one brilliant thing that you mentioned, and first I want to note, Anu, I'm like hearing you loud and clear. It's a great shame on the university that it hasn't been centering the voices of the most oppressed. There's these like small half measures that are starting to happen. I'm not super hopeful that it's gonna go nearly as far as it needs to, which is why I find my most important connections usually people outside of the academy, and then I try and bring those voices in. But it's certainly no reason to give up, and we need to keep pushing and keep advocating. And I really appreciated what Joanna said about that the tenured people need to be doing that. CalArts, we don't have tenure, so it's kind of weird, but that it's really on the tenured people, and they've failed us to sort of do that. And tenure has made some of the most reactionary conservative people that I know. Oh, Jesus, I'm saying this recording, but anyway, that we need to really fundamentally rethink the university if we do want to actually have it live by new and different principles. But okay, one thing that I really liked that Joanne said was, people who approach technology not through the most high-tech, greatest advance, but people who have a sort of, let's say, mid-tech approach to things. Here I'm thinking of people in prisons who've come up with some of the most clever and innovative technology under immense constraints. I'm thinking of the people of Cuba who've been able to use and reutilize technology under embargo. And I think that it's this form of small fabrication. It's this think of incredibly cunning and clever use of technology that, for me, I think drives innovation in a much more interesting way than, sort of like big-minded tech entrepreneurship, disruptive, this, that, and the other thing. And I think, as people work with those communities, there's a sort of understanding of what that technology is and what it's doing and who it benefits and why they're sort of in those conditions that makes it really interesting and helpful. I came of age politically during the anti-globalization movement. So it meant there were a lot of people and communities like that were the center of my attention. Of course, the biggest one was the Zapatistas and, the electronic intifada and these other things that sort of came in and through it. And I think that the more that we think and approach those, it's interesting. I'm thinking here of like Teddy Cruz, for instance, at UC San Diego, who has all these like kind of funny, jokey projects too about like, okay, so Tijuana and other places in Mexico are used as a sort of rubbish dumping ground for recycling. What if we imagine architecture actually being made that way and shipping it back north over the border once again? It's not necessarily thought to be sort of practical, but it understands the material of this sort of technology, its flows, its social consequences, and then we sort of approach it again. And there is this other approach that I'm not as persuaded by, which is like the Schumacher small is beautiful sort of human scale, or the Paulo Freire about people just sort of like using technology in a sort of a small community sort of sense. But I think it's worth considering as well, sort of like if we were to really make durable communities of the future, maybe technology needs to be emphasized. It's not something that we get rid of, but there need to be more paradigms of development. It would be degrowth, slow growth, other stuff like that. And I let a lot of my other colleagues focus a lot on sort of climate change, so I'm not thinking as clearly on those avenues, but I think that's absolutely important as the climate emergency just gets more and more dramatic. It's like, what, are we just going to get everyone air conditioners? Like, that's certainly not the solution. And I think that's the same thing with smartphones. I mean, coltan mining, lithium mining, they're huge commodities. They go up and down a lot. There's slave conditions in doing it. And so like, what would it even mean to have an ethical supply chain or commodity chain? We don't even know what that is. Some people tried to create an ethical smartphone and they were unable to do it. So I think we've got big questions, and there's a lot of question marks right now.
You're reminding me of a student I had last semester who said, "Oh, I hate human-centered design." And I thought that was hilarious, but he made a point, which is the human in human-centered design is this abstracted, idealized, dominant culture human. It's not actually centered to any individual human. And so it ends up being almost more abstract than if it was just a design object for a purpose, right? So because that whole question again of who is the human that you're designing for, is it a left-handed human, is it a right-handed human, right? Is it a neurotypical human, is it a human who has sensory issues and input, who needs something to be made a different way, right? We don't ask those questions so much in human-centered design. I think we're starting to, but what would it mean to have post-human centered design, right? Which was about making sure that our human needs were met, but also the Earth's needs were met. I think to your point about the lack of an ethical smartphone, we have expanded our consciousness tremendously by exploiting the resources of the Earth as a species. It's our calling card. How are we going to change that dynamic so that we don't destroy ourselves at what might be our cultural peak? It wouldn't be the first time humans have done that.
Yeah, I think
so
that,
well, go ahead, Andrew. It's your show. I'm just crashing the party. So
really briefly, I was going to say that I think the thing that hasn't been investigated as much is statistics. like a social and cultural study of statistics. There's this great book, Standards and Their Stories, that goes back to like Quetelet's statistical or average human, average man, that we've sort of used for so long. AI so much is based on statistics and statistical modeling. And obviously, like, statistics themselves go back to a form of statecraft in the early modern period that is used about sort of management. And it was a shift in philosophy away from things like just distribution to efficient distribution. And that's sort of the era we're still sort of living in. And so I think that the question of like, what do we consider as the standard as Anu is saying is great. You know, we have this sort of Black feminist critique from Sylvia Wynter, and Catherine McKittrick's New Science book, I think, is absolutely foundational in this. But I think that, you know, quick digression, I worked in anti-nuclear advocacy for a while, some of it against the UC's, you know, weapons design, but also the whole US nuclear complex, including the nuclear fuel chain, which is very deeply tied to indigenous communities who are still feeling the radioactive effects of it. And what is so boggles my mind is the statistical human, or like the average man, that was used in their modeling for decades upon decades. I mean, I think maybe like 50 or 60 years was a man, and it did not include a reproductive system, which is one of the aspects of the nuclear fuel chain that it's most destructive on. And so like the Marshall Islands, which is where the early hydrogen bombs were tested out in the Pacific Island US protectorate, it created whole clusters of reproduction problems in which women were giving birth to what they were calling jellyfish babies, because they were coming out looking like a very mutated lump of cells. They haven't even gotten full retribution from the US government over this. And so I think that statistics and the ways in which statistical modeling are becoming increasingly prevalent, because they're being used in a lot of the computational approaches that we're doing right now. I think we need a lot more work on like, what are those models? Where do they come from? What are the social consequences? What are being encoded and embedded in them? And how do we really take more into account? Because that's going to be so essential, especially with something like AI. But yeah, sorry.
So if I can jump in, in my eyes, you know, you're each of you, you know, impressive, accomplished people with your heart and mind in the right place. You know, I mean, you're here for very positive reasons, with very acute observations about, you know, things that the world needs, and at the same time, you have something in common with, let's say, the Buddha or Ohiyesa or Lao Tzu or Socrates or whoever your heroes through time may be. And that's that everyone, all of us and everyone before us, was once a child. You know, that all of us actually started relatively blank and became whatever we are. So there's a question of, well, how did each of you actually arrive at this? I mean, that seems to me to be the hard problem. Making cool things is actually trivially easy. You know, but making people, and not making in a sort of forcing people, but letting them thrive in that sense, that's a more difficult thing. Let me add this thing also, because I have this sort of running dialogue with Anu right now, with the transhuman and the posthuman, and this word that came to me congruent with the allosphere, you know, the allohuman. And what I mean by that is that, well, we're trying to make AIs conscious and robots autonomous. And so on the one hand, we want to sort of empower them. On the other hand, we're making them slaves in factories. So how are we not going to discriminate against them? What is the ethical upbringing of an AI or a robot? How do we not simply replicate the injustices that we have to a new life form? And so I think I'm going to just embrace talking about the allohuman, you know, meaning let's put in all the humans and all the aliens and all the robots and all the machines and everything that is lifelike or consciousness-like, and all the octopods and the crows and every creature in the world into something that needs to be respected, something that we need to be in a certain way toward. But then, how do we bring that up? Because you could just as well imagine that there are going to be neoliberal capitalist AI entrepreneurs who take over Amazon. I mean, why not? If you're going to do that, that could happen. So how do you not do that? And then finally, here's I think the really, tactically, to use Andrew's word, the hardest problem, which is that we live under a political economy that generates advantage that is actually efficient in certain ways. So you have billions of people, 7.2, 7.3 billion people on the planet, that all need to somehow go to work and be educated and be fed and fight pandemics. And that system, for all its injustices, manages to do that. I mean, people have jobs, they might be underpaid, and a lot of them might be homeless. I live in downtown LA, so there's no forgetting that. But we don't have an alternative. We don't have a more efficient way of organizing, but we have a model. We see nature, and nature is actually distributed and autonomous and does all these amazing things. And we haven't found a way to actually organize ourselves and bring ourselves up to create a new kind of ecology that is inclusive and all the good things that we want to do. So I don't know. I started trying to make this into a question about yourselves, and then it mutated. So to bring it back to the question, I think you're all exemplary. And let's say I win, all the lotteries in the world, and I say, okay, I'm going to fund you, and we're all going to make a think tank, and we're going to try to figure out not how to make copies of ourselves, but to enable each person to sort of land in a respectful, empathetic, compassionate place that is good for humans and machines and animals and everything good. Last thing, and I'm sorry, it's just so tempting. You've all provoked so many great things. One balancing thing for me is that when I look out at the stars, and the consciousness of billions upon billions of planets, I think all the conflicts that we have on Earth are petty. They're just absolutely foolish, because the unknown is so much larger than the known that there's no point in arguing about our differences. Our differences are nothing. And if we could just get our heads together and our hearts together, then we could actually look at this bigger scope without killing one another, So that's it. Sorry for you're all very tempting in each of your own ways, and so I thank you all, and I thank Digital Futures also for it.
I just wanted to, I guess, say thank you very much, all of the panelists. Thank you, Professor Novak, for coming on board and offering some very deep and provocative questions. I think right now we're going to start wrapping up the session, but I just wanted to start with maybe Andrew, then Anu, and then finalize with Dr. Kuchamaran. So Andrew, take it away. Any final thoughts about how we can make these things better, ask provocative questions, or just come together as I don't know. Every time I hear you, I have so many questions. So take it away.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll just say that, for me, I think that it's not so much a critique of all technology. It's about trying to figure out what is our way forward. I have no real ideas on an ethical way forward. I do have a political way forward that way, though, and I think it repeats the words of Fannie Lou Hamer, who said that nobody's free until everybody's free. And for me, that means beginning from the perspective of her, of Sylvia Rivera, of a kid in Palestine, but also great conceptual provocateurs like Jean Genet or someone like that, and imagining what would they think or say about technology, not because they have great technological know-how, but because they have a way of approaching the world, which is the one that I want to live in. So thank you so much, and really appreciate being in the conversation today.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And Anu, let's hear it.
Okay, so I think, in response to Professor Novak's comments, I was reminded of Timothy Morton's discussion of the film WALL-E, the Pixar film, in which he asserts essentially, if I can paraphrase, that what it is about the little robot WALL-E that makes him so convincing as a protagonist is that he experiences the emotion of climate grief. He's in mourning for the earth that he cannot save from its own trash and destruction, right? Because he's a trash collecting robot. And then the other part of that film that's so beautiful is that it's about love. It's about two robots that fall in love with one another, and they feel a responsibility for care. So I think that's where I come down, is that instead of training systems to optimize human beings to be less human, to be more human than human, what if we were to optimize for all the messiest parts of being human and accept and embrace those and lead with those, if the blood and the guts was actually what we loved? And so I always go back to Namjoon Paik. And when he made his famous robot for the 21st century, he made sure that his robot had nipples and it defecated, right? That he had this kind of connection to nurturing and to that biological process that connects the mind to the anus, that keeps us grounded so that we don't always have our heads up in the clouds.
Thank you very much, Anu, as always, provocative. And yeah, there's so much to think about. I guess I want to end today's panel with Dr. Kuchamaran and her thoughts and struggles, but also maybe a line of hope. Like, what can we hope for with all this criticality and computation?
Well, what I'm going to say is going to be very esoteric and very out there because, I can't help myself. But what if that the beginning of this universe, when the Big Bang happened, it was an entity that was waking up, that was alone and wanted to love and wanted to have, and it just started shaking itself, and it broke into a million pieces, and every single reflection of itself was every single one of us. What if we're one entity? What if we're all connected? What if we're one spirit? If this is the case, then if I hurt anybody, I hurt myself. If I don't love anyone, I don't love myself. So how can we bring this next evolution of consciousness about? How can we look at all of this incredible technology and understand quantum consciousness for really what it is, for us to get back to our roots and who we are, and to love one another and just enjoy every day on the planet? Because if this is eternity, and if there is a day of Brahman and a night of Brahman, and the spirit wakes up and breaks into pieces, and then we all go back together again, and it goes to sleep and it breaks into pieces, and we all, then this must be it. Every day that we live must be what we are and who we are, and we must love one another. I know this has nothing to do with anything that we're talking about with technology, but I'm hoping against hope that this is really the case, and that the phoenix is going to arise from the flames again, and we're going to love one another again for maybe just a little while. Anyway, I'm done.
Well, I wanted to say thank you very much again for all the panelists, Dr. Kuchamaran, Andrew, Anu, and Professor Marcus Novak, that came as a supporter of Digital Futures, but also he's been an inspiration in my life intellectually as well as creatively. And Dr. Locke, who left us a bit early, but gave a great presentation. So I thank you all, and let's say goodbye to all of our people, but I hope we speak again soon. Take care.
Bye. Thanks, everybody. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.